In Tokyo, a tall Starbucks coffee will set you back almost $5. Here in New York, Yumiko Ono discovers it's less than $2. She joins us now from Tokyo on set, managing editor of the Wall Street Journal's Japanese language site over there. It was so funny, you mentioned this offhand, but it's a really telling example of what the strong yen is doing to the Japanese economy.
Yeah, let me tell you how thrilled I was to go into a Starbucks. Oh my God, less than $2. I mean, where I live, $4.50, and you know, that's not so bad.
That's amazing.
All things considering, and that is the story of Japan and where it's going. Because the strong yen, it has implications for every company that exports. You know,
especially some of the big auto companies. Explain how this is affecting them.
Yeah, for instance, Toyota, it makes about half the cars in Japan, which means that it exports a lot of cars. Nissan and Honda, they make about a third of the cars in Japan, and they make all the rest of the cars outside Japan. So what is this? What happens for Toyota? Okay, so you know their earnings were announced, and they have better implications for the rest of the fiscal year, but their projections are not as good as for Honda and Nissan.
Because more of their cost base is
That's
strengthening.
Right. As it is in Japan, there's higher cost. It's really expensive to make things in Japan. And added to that, the strong yen means that it's even, you know, it becomes more expensive
and
to
you
do
see
that.
companies, as a result, perhaps shifting more and more of their production outside of Japan. Ultimately not a good thing for the country.
Right. It's going through a huge industrial shift in that way. The current account surplus, which is, you know, how much Japan earns from trade and investment overseas, that was announced overnight, and that shrunk. Fastest rate on record in 2011.
Yeah. Yumiko, what are the prospects for major structural change in Japan? I know we talk about it, I mean, we've been talking about this for a couple of decades now, but Japan has some major structural...
You mean when is it time to short JGBs?
No, I mean structural and demographic problems. There's still a lot of huge deficit spending. They have deficits, I mean, much higher deficits as a percentage of GDP than even in the United States. Higher ratio of government debt in the world. And it all relies upon Japanese consumers to kind of finance this. When will the Japanese consumer say enough? When will Japanese politics change and change the structure?
You know,
of the
that is a really good question. That's what everyone in Japan is talking about right now. The change has not seemed to come yet, but you know, people keep talking about, well, when is it? When is it? Is it now? Is it going to be in 2 years? Is it going to be in 5 years? At some point, there's got to be a change in the Japanese consumer and the sentiment. If this keeps going, you know, there's not a lot of change in politics right now, and something's got to give.
I mean, it's absolutely amazing because what's happening is that, you know, you had over the last 20 or 30, or say going back into the 70s, you had the rise of great Japanese companies, a Honda or a Toyota or a Sony. And basically you know, not that they're falling that far behind. Toyota is still a very well-run, great company. But the lack of new company creation, business formation, the rise of new Japanese companies, they've really been hurt by the yen.
Yeah.
And what happens too ultimately if Japan, being such a big exporter, isn't able to export its way to growth as much as it did in the past?
And you know, Japan has always been an exporter. It sees itself as an exporter, and it's going to be an identity crisis too if it's not going to be as much of an exporter as before.
What's going on with the politics there? Sorry.
No, I was going to ask the same thing.
Yeah, well, politics, you know, the DPJ has been in power for quite some time. That was a huge change in government and in the structure, but now the people are increasingly disappointed in what this new party wasn't able to do. That was all seen during the earthquake and the aftermath, and who knows what'll happen.
Yeah, a bit of the Obama effect where there was this new party, came into office, new people, and they didn't just carry out what people had hoped would happen.
Right,
and now
right, a huge letdown, huge disappointment.
The problem with Japan, the U.S. has a similar problem, which is you have huge vested interests in the status quo in Japan, especially among the older Japanese population. You know, it's very hard to change societies where there's a lot of vested interest. We have the very similar problems in the U.S., but in Japan they're probably even worse.
Well, and even
and
the
it takes a
reaction to
huge
these
shakeup to get anything changed.
Well, it goes back
in
to the
Japan.
whole zombie bank thing after the collapse, and this concern that if they had just realized losses in the first place, it would have been better for the economy long term. I mean, and just remind us again why the yen is so strong. Why at a time when we're talking about the weakness of the Japanese economy, that paradoxically its currency seems to be the problem.
It is. It is. I mean, it does seem paradoxical. If, you know, Japan is getting weaker, then the yen should be weaker too. But the yen is getting stronger. It really is a big problem for all the exporters. But at the same time, for consumers, things are getting cheaper if you're importing things. If you're importing, I don't know, clothes or food or anything. So this really is a good time to talk about trade and how to change things, how to import more. But there's not a lot of, you know, there are people who are for more imports and for more of an open market, but there's a huge, amount of vested interest in keeping things as status quo, as you say. So there's a lot of opposition for that as well. And that, because of that, the net effect is that there hasn't been, a huge amount of change, which Japan really needs right now.
Yeah, and just curious, by the way, as we're seeing this bizarre kind of these weather conditions play out across the world. Extreme cold in Europe. It's been extremely mild here. The earthquakes that happened in Japan were themselves an anomaly. But what about that? What is the weather broadly like across?
That's a good question. It snowed in Tokyo for the first time in, I don't know, it hasn't snowed that much. And then it was so cold that the snowman that we built had not melted for a whole week.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's colder in Tokyo now than in New York. I was really amazed.